We're going to try again. We'll pray and we'll jump in, and we will leave that light off. Okay, Lord, we just ask that you would meet with us here tonight and have your hand of blessing upon all we do and say. And Lord, as we go through these chapters in the book of Genesis, please speak through me. Please help us to just learn something about you and hopefully be more like you in this next week. And Lord, every week we get together and study the Bible. We pray that you would please help us to see whatever it is, whatever defects of character are in our life that you want us to see, that we can change and we can work on to be more like you. And any weaknesses, Lord, if there's anything we're supposed to be doing that we're not, please help us to see that, because, Lord, I know that most of us, we want to do your will instead of ours. And the fact is, the Spirit's willing, but the flesh is weak. We just don't have it in us to do your will instead of ours. So we ask for your help with that. We love you, and in Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, Genesis chapter 39. So quick review of the story of Joseph so far. Really what you have is Joseph was one of the favored children of his father Jacob. And Jacob had Joseph in somewhat of a leadership role. And the other 10 brothers didn't like that. Now I say 10 because Benjamin was very young at the time. Benjamin was the only full-blooded brother of Joseph. They had the same mom and dad. Everyone else was a half-brother. And the 10 half-brothers didn't seem to like Joseph, and they ended up having a desire to get rid of him, and the plan was to kill him. And then they were talked out of that plan, and they said, okay, well, let's sell him into slavery. And they ended up selling him to a group of Midianites who brought him down to Egypt and sold him into the hands of Potiphar. And that was the end of, I believe, chapter 37. Chapter 38 is a break where it tells a different story about the 10 brothers and Jacob back home. And then chapter 39, we get back to the story of Joseph, and that's what we're jumping into now. So follow along with me for the first six verses of chapter 39, and then we'll get into it. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in the sight, and he served him. And he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had put into his hand. And it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had, in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. Okay, so, excuse me. There's a lot of good stuff in these verses, and in the first two, we're going to look at, an idea that'll take us to another part of the Bible. Turn with me to Joshua chapter 1, verse 8. We're going to get there in a minute after we read the first two verses, or look at the first two verses in Genesis chapter 39. So just put your red ribbon there in Joshua chapter 1, verse 8, and then look at Genesis 39 again. All right, so at this point in the story of Joseph, how old is Joseph? Anyone want to guess? MacArthur.
17.
Very good. He's 17 years old. And I think it told us that back in chapter 37. It told us that Joseph was 17 years old when his brothers kidnapped him, threw him in the well, sold him to the Ishmaelites, and he was sold into slavery. He was 17 years old. All right, now Potiphar, in verse 1, we find Potiphar was a high-ranking official. Potiphar means one devoted to the sun. We know that in Egypt, they worshiped the sun and the sun god. That was one of the main gods that they worshipped. That goes all the way back to long ago. We'll talk about that later as we move forward a little bit. Now, in verse 2, and this is the point that I really want to drive home, and this is the interesting thing for me. In verse 2, we see that there are two things here that we should want. One, the Lord was with Joseph. That is something I hope we would all want in our lives. I think to myself, if the Lord is with Patrick, I'm doing pretty well. That's a great place to start. And then number 2, we see that he was prosperous. Now, when I was looking at this, I had this thought, and I've come across it many times in the Bible. Far too many times when we read through the Bible or we hear a story in the Bible about someone who is blessed by God and someone that does wonderful things and someone that's very close to God, we think that it is some type of special relationship that they have that is unattainable for us. Like, God could never use me to do this, or I could never be close to God like this person in the Bible was. And that just flat is not true. You and I today can be blessed of God just as much as Joseph was. And the Bible explains how to do that. And one of the places we read that is in Joshua chapter 1, verse 8. So look there with me, and I'm going to show you that the blessing that Joseph had, that he prospered, and that the Lord was with Joseph. It wasn't that Joseph was something extra special that God picked. Joseph did what God said and therefore received what God promised. In Joshua chapter 1 verse 8, we read, and this is God speaking to Joshua when Joshua is about to take over as the leader of the nation of Israel. God says, "This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein. For then thou shalt make thy way prosperous, and then thou shalt have good success." So we see here that there are two ingredients. If you want to have good success and be prosperous, you want the blessing of God upon you, God's hand of blessing upon you, and you want to be prosperous. What are the two things we need to do? Washington?
Meditate on the Bible.
Got to meditate on the Bible. And what else?
You got to do what the Bible says.
You got to do what the Bible says. Those are the two things we have to do to be successful and prosperous as far as what God says. Now, in the timeline of Joshua chapter 1 verse 8, this is immediately after the death of Moses. So Joshua was to take over the role of Moses and lead the children of Israel. And God said to Joshua, do you want to be prosperous? Do you want to have success? Meditate on this book and do what it says. That's what is required. Now, this is the thing that so many people never even try. They never even do an experiment. That truth in the Bible in Joshua 1:8 is just as applicable for us today as it was for Joshua. It worked for Joseph in chapter 39 of Genesis. The same God that wrote the book and blessed them is the same God that can bless us today. The Bible isn't a book to be scared of. It's a book to read. That's all we got to do. We have to read the book, and to the best of our ability, we got to do what it says. And so many Christians are not willing to take that simple challenge. I'm going to set aside a little bit of time, and I'm going to read so many chapters a day, and I'm going to get through this book. I'm going to learn what it says, and I'm going to figure out what God wants me to do. We do that small thing, and God says you're going to have success, you're going to be prosperous. That's it. It's a simple formula. Now, what is the number one complaint, fear, apprehension when you bring up the challenge of reading the Bible? What do you think the number one thing people say is? MacArthur?
I don't understand.
I don't understand the Bible. Okay? This is my answer to everyone that says that. And it's a popular thing. Well, I just don't understand it when I read it. Don't worry about the parts you don't understand. Worry about the parts you do understand. Read through the Bible, and to the best of your ability, whatever is clear, do that. And whatever is clear that God says to stop doing that. And that's it. Every time I read through the Bible, every time I read through a book of the Bible, I learn something new. The reason is God didn't need me to know it before. He had other things he was trying to teach me. I don't have to worry about all the stuff that I don't understand. All I got to do is, to the best of my ability, read the book and do what it says. And we will prosper and have success. Okay. That's it. Moving on to verse number 3. In verse number 3, we see that the blessing of God is noticeable to other people. It says that his master saw that the Lord was with him. In verses 4 through 6, we find out that Joseph ran everything in the house of Potiphar. It says in verse 6 that Potiphar didn't know what was going on in his own house aside from what he ate for breakfast. He said, other than the bread that I eat, I don't know what's going on in my own house. Joseph's taking care of it. And let me tell you, Joseph, the guy that was sold into slavery, I assume he wasn't put into this position on day one with Potiphar. There was probably a period where Potiphar learned about this guy and realized the hand of God was on him. But the point is, he moved into a position of authority where things were good. As far as the average Egyptian went, things couldn't get much better than being in charge of the house of a powerful man in Egypt. Now, what was the title we find in the Bible that we would give Joseph? What was he to Potiphar? What's the name? What's the word? Racking our brains. What's that?
Foreman?
Foreman. That's what we'd use on a construction site for sure. Starts with an S. Does that help anyone?
No.
Starts with an ST.
Steward?
What's that?
Steward?
Steward. Very good. He was the steward. Now, the Bible defines a steward as someone that has all the authority of the master of the house. Okay, they are given all the authority. A steward was a trusted servant that answered to nobody but the master. The steward typically ran everything. Now, something to remember, as I said before, is this probably did not happen overnight, but the point is Joseph was still a young man, and he was put into a position of great power and authority over this one man's house simply because he was close to God. He was obeying the word of God. Now, let's look at verses 7 through 10. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, lie with me. But he refused, and said unto his master's wife, behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me, but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her. Okay, so the wife of Potiphar is about to bring all the good times to the end. She's about to ruin everything. She is attracted to Joseph, and she makes that known unto him. And Joseph rebuffs her advances, and he explains that he cannot sin against God or his master. Okay? It's interesting that Joseph says, how can I do this wicked thing and sin against God? Joseph knew, because of the word of God, that this was a wicked thing, and he could not do it. Okay, that was the reason Joseph said, nope, can't do it. Nope, not gonna happen. Now, in verse 10, we see that the sexual harassment in the workplace continued and increases. And Joseph has to deal with this every day. And we can guess where this is going. In verses 11 through 20, we read, and it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. And it came to pass, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, saying, see, he hath brought in an Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. Now that's a lie. And it came to pass, when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, The Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, After this manner did the servants to me, that his wrath was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. Okay, a lot happened here, so let's take a look. So in verses 11 and 12, what did Joseph do that was wrong here? In verses 11 and 12, what was the mistake?
He went in the house by himself. There wasn't anybody else there except
That's right.
his wife.
Joseph went into the house when there was no one there but he and the wife of Potiphar. So all of a sudden, it's what the police call a he said, she said. We don't know who's lying. Sounds like both of you are. Okay, so we can't tell. There's no way to prove it. So that's the lesson that we learn there, is that just one additional witness makes it safe. Okay, so Joseph went in and was in the house when the wife of Potiphar was there, and he knew that she was trouble. And it even says that he noticed that no one else was there, and maybe the appropriate thing would have been to leave, okay, and to bring someone else in there with him. Now, when she corners him, he flees. And that obviously was the right thing to do. However, he fled just a little too quickly, and he left his garment there, so she had an identifying, item, and he gets in trouble. So verses 13 to 18, Potiphar comes home, and his wife tells him her version of the story. Now, this is interesting, and this brings us back several chapters. But what is the phrase she uses to describe the actions of Joseph? Mac.
He mocked me.
He mocked me. Okay. Now, in verses 14 and 17, she says Joseph mocked her. Now, you and I today, we think of the word mock to mean laughed at or ridiculed or made fun of. But that word in the Bible here has a sexual connotation. We saw that used before in the Bible. Does anyone remember where that was? For an extra gold star. No guesses?
Yeah, I'll get this try.
Yeah, everyone's thinking. Okay. When Sarah was angry with Ishmael, and she got so mad that she said, Abraham, Hagar, and her son Ishmael gotta leave. They're done. I'm sick of it. They got to get out of here. They cannot live with us anymore. It was because Ishmael mocked Isaac as a little boy. It was more than just, a recess type of schoolyard making fun of one another. Okay, Ishmael was doing something inappropriate with Isaac, and Sarah saw it and got so mad, she said, they have to be banished from our household. And Abraham obliged. Okay, it was the same word. They used the term mocked. Just remember that. Okay, in verses 19 and 20. Now, here's a question. Okay, I want you all to think about this. And let's see. In verse 20, it says, And Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. Okay, sorry. Verse 19. And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which spake unto him, saying, After this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. Here's a question. In verse 19 and 20, it says, The wrath of Potiphar was kindled. Against who?
It's Joseph.
Yeah, everyone assumes Joseph, right? Whenever we read that, we think his wrath was kindled. It must have been against Joseph. I don't believe it was. I believe his wrath was kindled against his wife. Remember, Joseph was a great blessing to Potiphar. Everything that Joseph touched was blessed of God. Potiphar saw that, and he loved having Joseph around. So much so that he entrusted Joseph with his entire estate. Potiphar loved having Joseph in charge. And the Bible doesn't say who his wrath was kindled against. This incident with his wife meant he had to respond with some course of action that was appropriate. Some type of punishment had to be carried out. And I think Potiphar was upset about that because I think Potiphar knew the type of woman his wife was. If she was the type that was a liar and deceptive and manipulative and one that would chase after other men, I don't believe that was the first time. I think Potiphar knew that. And Potiphar's wrath was kindled against his wife because he had to do something against Joseph. Now, let me ask you this. If what the wife of Potiphar said was true, what would the punishment have been at that time? Death. He would have had to have executed him. But he didn't do that. He threw him in prison instead. And I think that was him being merciful because he loved Joseph. He knew what a great guy Joseph was, but he had to do something. Again, that is conjecture. The Bible doesn't say it, but you can't prove that he was mad at Joseph either. The Bible doesn't say that. All right, let's look at verses 21, 22, and 23. Let's see. But the Lord was with Joseph, even in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. And whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him. And that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. So, again, Joseph still had the Lord by his side. If we are faithful to God, then God will stand by us, even during the hard times, even when we are unjustly persecuted, even when we are thrown in prison unjustly. God will still be with us. Okay, in verse 22, just as Joseph rose to prominence and position of authority in the house of Potiphar, he did it again in the prison. And in verse 23, again we see Joseph prosper even while incarcerated. The warden turned over all his responsibilities to Joseph, just as Potiphar did. So the question for the day, at the end, we're going to see that Joseph held two positions of authority. Okay, he had two jobs while he was in Egypt. And this is the first one that he got, warden over the prison. It was a prison that he was incarcerated in, but that just goes to show, what a great guy he was. Okay, let's go to chapter 40. We're moving right along. Verses 1 through 5. And it came to pass after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. That's not a good thing to do. And Pharaoh, when they're talking about the king of Egypt, that's who they're talking about. That's Pharaoh. And Pharaoh was wroth against two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers. And he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued a season in ward. And they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream, and one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. Okay, now the majority of this chapter, we're just telling the story. So, very simply, Joseph is in prison, and who are the two guys that Pharaoh throws in there? Wash?
The chief of the bakery.
And Mom?
The chief of the butler.
Good. The butler and the baker. Okay? The head of each.
I
Yes.
have a quick word.
Ask the question. Go for it.
In 4, it says, and he served them, and they continued a season.
Yep.
So, like spring or a season a year? Or
See,
what
and it's
is
a shame you asked that, because I was just going to say, I don't know what that amount of time is.
Oh.
Now, we're going to touch on the time frame. The only thing we know is from the time Joseph is sold to the house of Potiphar, he's 17, and the time he gets out of prison and serves Pharaoh, he's 30. So we know there's 13 years in there. How long was he in the house of Potiphar? How long was he in prison? We don't know, but it was a long time. Yeah, so unfortunately, it doesn't give any more specifics than that. Okay, so we have the butler and the baker. They're in prison with them. They get to know Joseph. Joseph's in charge. They have dreams. And then that brings us to verse number 6. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his Lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sadly today? And they said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. Okay, and let's see. So, both guys have a dream in one night. That seems odd. Some could call it coincidence. Most of us who know God often call it divine. Joseph notices that they are sad, and he inquires about it. This shows us something about the character of Joseph. He was attentive to others. And then in verse 8, I don't know if Joseph was confident that God would give him an interpretation of the dream, but Joseph wants to make sure that God gets the credit. So before he even hears what the dream is, he says, God's the one that can interpret it. Why don't you tell me what it is? And it just so happens that God does tell him exactly what it is. And we'll read about the dream here in verses 8 through 11. So, and they said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. Starting in verse 9. And the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, In my dream, behold, a vine was before me. And in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and her blossom shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup unto Pharaoh's hand. All right. So the chief butler gives Joseph his dream, and here in verse 12, he is going to tell us what it means. And Joseph said unto him, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine hand and restore thee unto thy place. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head and restore thee unto thy place, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand after the former manner when thou wast his butler. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. Okay, so in verses 12 and 13, guess what, butler? Great news. 3 days, you're going to get out. And you're going to serve Pharaoh again. You're going to have the same job you did before. That sounds great. I'm sure the butler was excited. He was probably counting down the 3 days to see if Joseph was correct, but it was good news nonetheless. Now, in verses 14 and 15, Joseph adds something, and he asked the butler to mention him and his situation to Pharaoh. Pharaoh, he is hoping, will act on his behalf and get him removed from jail. After all, Joseph has done nothing wrong, and he asked the butler to tell Pharaoh this. Seems like a reasonable request. Now, I don't want to appear too cynical, but do you think Joseph was the only guy sitting in jail telling everyone that he didn't do it?
No.
I would imagine that was the conversation of every guy in the jail. I have personally sat in several jail cells over the years, and that's the only story I've ever heard. I didn't do it. So we find out that the butler forgot about Joseph and his situation, and I don't know why that is, but for whatever reason. Now, let's look at Genesis verses 16 through 19 in chapter 40. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. And in the uppermost basket there was all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh, and the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. And Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days. And yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off of thee. All right, so I find these verses hysterical, because the butler just told Joseph his dream, and Joseph told the butler, hey, good news, 3 days you're out, you're getting your old job back, this is great. And then you can just see the baker sitting next to him listening. He's like, that's great, let me tell you my dream. And he tells him his dream, and he says, and Joseph doesn't even soften it up. There's not even a segue. Well, you might want to sit down for this. He just gets right into it and says, in 3 days, you're going to have your head cut off, and they're going to nail you to a tree, and the birds are going to come and eat you.
And he's like,
And this is the same level of tact and discernment Joseph seemed to have way back when he was telling his brothers and his father of his dreams that got him in trouble. It was just very matter of fact. Anyway, I don't know if that makes me strange, but I find that to be just hysterical. So the baker was thinking, boy, I'm going to get the same news, and instead he hears about how in 3 days he is going to be executed and the birds are going to eat his carcass. Now, a couple things. Number one, in Egypt at the time, the custom was that between the kitchen and the dining area, what they would do is they would cook the food, the baked meats they're talking about, and they would put them in baskets. They would carry the baskets on their head, and they would walk from the kitchen across these open courtyards over to the dining area to feed whoever it was. So the idea that the birds would come down and try to eat from these baskets was a normal occurrence. And furthermore, it was a real problem in the cities because birds were protected. The birds were considered sacred, and it was unlawful to kill them. So it was a real problem that they had whenever they would do this. So now also, Joseph's explanation of the manner of execution on the baker was actually historically accurate. We found out other historical records corroborate this story and tell us that decapitation was a common form of execution for criminals, and then they would oftentimes hang the body up to display it, and the reason was it was to be a deterrent for future crimes. And that was a regular mode of execution in the days of Egypt at this time. Anyway, okay, you got a question? Yes, sir.
Any speculation on what the baker did, or the butler did to get his head cut off? I mean, it doesn't say. But
We find out 3 days from this time what happens in 3 days. Because he said 3 days to both of them, right? What happens in 3 days, Mom?
the butler goes free.
No. We know what's going to happen to each of them, but why is one released and one executed in 3 days? Nobody read ahead.
I can know.
Go ahead, Mac. What is it?
It was Pharaoh's birthday.
Very good. It was Pharaoh's birthday. So what we find out is that it was customary for Pharaoh to let a criminal go on his birthday. And at the same time, it was very common on holidays, on the birthday of someone special, that they would take someone out and publicly execute them. Now, it doesn't say this, but we're going to get into it in a second. But it seems, the way the story reads, that Pharaoh on his birthday said, bring forth the butler and the baker. And Pharaoh decided, one of you is going to live and one of you is going to die. And we don't know how he decided. I don't know if he flipped a coin or what he did. But the reason he did both was because it was his birthday and that was a special event, and we're going to kill a criminal and we're going to let one free, and that was a special thing they did. They would do that all the way through Roman times as well. During the time of Christ, we found out why were they getting rid of, or why were they setting a slave free? Okay, it's because of the special time of the year. So anyway, that was pretty regular, and we're going to see those historical sources that tell us that as well. But it seems that they were both called forward, And Pharaoh made a decision, okay, you know, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, one of you is going to go free. And I could only imagine how much they were both sweating, wondering, you know, did Joseph get this right, or am I really the other one? Anyway, so let's see where we are. Okay, I completely lost our place. Okay, here we go. Verses 20 through 23. Finish up the chapter of 40. And it came to pass the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast on all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and the chief baker among his servants, and he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, and he gave the cup unto Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but he forgot him. So, as you can see, he called them both out of prison, and he said, you're restored, and you are going to be executed, and it doesn't say why. I would imagine it was just chance. He had to pick one, and for whatever reason, he might have let the crowd decide, like in the Roman, arenas for the gladiators. We have no idea. But either way, that was the case behind it. Okay, so let's see. Let's give one more thing. So the interpretation Joseph gave was spot on. And we're going to find out that this does help Joseph out in the future. Not immediately. The butler forgets about him, but it will help him out in the future. And going to a little bit of historical evidence here, the Rosetta Stone is a black basalt stone that was found outside of Rosetta, Egypt in 1798. It was found by French soldiers, and when they found it, they saw that it was written in 3 different languages, and they thought it was something special or important, so they brought it to their superiors. It ended up getting into the hands of Napoleon, and we find out that the stone tells the same proclamation written in 3 languages. And it's significant because one of those languages was hieroglyphics, and one of those languages was Greek. And the Rosetta Stone was the key in us learning the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic language that we know today. Without that stone, we never would have been able to figure it out. Do you know what that stone tells the story of? It tells a story of how the Pharaoh at the time would release somebody from prison every year on his birthday. Yep. Which I thought was kind of neat, since that's what we're talking about. So, yes, Washington.
How long did this pharaoh live for?
I'm not sure. I'd have to look it up. I don't even know this pharaoh's name. I think it was Ptolemy. I don't remember which one, because there were multiple. They did have weird names back then, MacArthur. Okay, let's read chapter 41, verses 1 through 8. And we're going to blow through 41, and by blow through it, I mean just barely make it through in time. Chapter 41, verses 1 through 8. Now, this is where it gets really exciting for Joseph. Okay? Young kid, almost killed by his brothers, sold into slavery, rises to prominence in the house of Potiphar, thrown into prison, serves in prison for many years, and now here we go. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. So, from the time the butler and the baker were taken out of prison to the time of Pharaoh's dream was how many years? 2. Okay, so this is a timeline marker. We read, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine and fat flesh, and they fed in the meadow. Kine are a type of cattle. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean kine upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kine, so Pharaoh awoke. So the dream was so realistic it scared him awake. And he slept and dreamed the second time, and behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears, and Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. All right. So, In verse 1, the phrase 2 full years is a timeline marker, giving us the idea of where we are in the story, because we know that Joseph was sold into slavery at the age of 17, and at the end of this chapter, we find out that he's 30 years old when he starts working for Pharaoh. Now, I'm sure we see where this is going, so I don't mind ruining what we're going to read in just a minute. Joseph's going to be called out of prison to interpret the dreams that Pharaoh is having. So we know that sometime between Potiphar's serving for Potiphar and being called out of prison was a span of 13 years. The Bible doesn't tell us how much was in prison and how much was in Potiphar's house, but even if we split that in half, that means that Joseph was in prison for over 6 years. I mean, he was in there for a long time. All right. In verse 8, this is the first mention of magicians in the Bible. Now, I find it interesting that the first mention of magicians in the Bible shows us that they were lacking. They were unable to do their job. Now, you would think that they would come up with something to tell Pharaoh, since that was their job, but they don't. Something we need to remember here, and this is pertinent. Magicians were priests of the ancient sun-worshipping pagan religion. They worshipped and received their power from demons. And it was as real as anything you or I have ever seen. American modern-day Christians have so much trouble with the idea that demonic powers and presences are real. Later on in Exodus chapters 7 and 8, we see magicians of Pharaoh turn their staffs into serpents and they turn water into blood. That is demonic power derived from demons that they worshipped in the sun worshipping pagan Egyptian religion. Okay? This pagan religion has its origin with Nimrod and the Tower of Babel. It was adopted by the Babylonians, and it continues today in many, many forms. And the devil and his demons don't care what you name it, so long as you worship them instead of God. That is the goal. The point I am making here is that Pharaoh turned to these men because of the powers they possessed. They were real, and he had reason to believe that these guys had abilities. In this case, it was a Jewish slave who had the answers. So, verses 9 through 13. Okay, starting in verse 9. Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servant, and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night, I and he. We dreamed each man according to the interpretation of the dream. And there was there with us a young man, an Hebrew servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams, to each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. So, the chief butler, all of a sudden, his memory is sparked. He remembers Joseph and how he interpreted the dreams in the prison. The butler tells Pharaoh about Joseph and what he did. And what does the Pharaoh want? He wants Joseph brought out so he can do the same thing for him. We find that starting in verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. Now that was normal. They're going to clean you up if you're going to stand in the presence of the king. I mean, that's pretty much customary all through every country and all of time. Verse 15, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, In my dream, behold, I stood upon the bank of the river, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them, poor and very ill-favored and lean-fleshed, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. And the lean and the ill-favored kine did eat up the first 7 fat kine. And when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them, but they were still ill-favored, as at the beginning. So I awoke, and I saw in a dream, and behold, 7 ears came up in one stalk, full and good, and behold, 7 ears withered, thin, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them, and the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears. And I told this unto the magicians, but there was none that could declare it unto me. Okay, so in verse 14, they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. That's what it says. Now, for all of us today, this is a reminder of how quickly our circumstances can change. If it is the will of God, you can go from the dungeon to ruling the most powerful country in the world, and it can happen in the span of a day. Well, that's what we find happens here with Joseph. In verses 15 and 16, Joseph again makes sure that everyone knows that it is God that is going to do this thing. And keep in mind, it's not just Joseph and Pharaoh sitting in Pharaoh's office having a conversation. Joseph is standing in front of the king of the world. There were certainly several armed guards there for the protection of Pharaoh. There were certainly all the magicians and the wise men and the sorcerers and all of Pharaoh's servants present. And Joseph is standing there and declaring, just so we're all clear, I don't have the interpretation, but God does, and he'll tell it. So he's given God the glory when he can. It is God's right to receive all the honor for all of our assets. Joseph always does this. And it is a lesson we should learn. When we are complimented, do we pass the compliment on to God? Okay, let's read verses 25 through 36, and let's see what Joseph tells Pharaoh and how this turns out for him. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good kine are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-favored kine that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears, blasted with the east wind, shall be 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine. And all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. And for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in 7 plenteous years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities, and that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. Okay, so let's look at this, and we're going to go over what I believe to be interesting point here. Pharaoh had 2 different dreams in one night. The 2 dreams showed us the same thing, and because of that, Joseph sees it as God authenticating his message. He's saying, God is showing you this to show you that it is real, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. After Joseph tells Pharaoh what is going to happen, he offers a solution. In verses 33 through 36, he tells Pharaoh, you have to pick a man who is going to be discreet and wise. Now here's Joseph, the son of a shepherd, who was made a slave and just released from a long prison sentence, and he is telling Pharaoh what to do and how to run his country. Joseph doesn't try to secure the position for himself. He never brings up, well, I could do this for you, Pharaoh. Let me take this opportunity and just fix the situation. He says, Pharaoh, you need to find a man who is wise and discreet, who can take care of this. And here's what you need to do. You need to do this and this and this and this and this in order to save the country. Joseph never tries to promote himself. Joseph lays out the plan that far too many of us don't adhere to. Now, I want to draw this out, and I'll try to do this briefly. Okay? So, we're going to get to that. Okay. So Joseph lays out the plan, and so we are right here, okay? And this is, okay, Pharaoh and Joseph. Now, from this point in the story, when will the famine arise? Washington.
In 7 years?
In 7 years. So what we're saying is the famine starts here. Is that what you're saying?
Yep.
Do we all agree?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So the famine starts. How long is the famine going to be, MacArthur?
7 years?
7 years as well. Okay. Now, from this point in the story where Joseph is talking to Pharaoh, when does God provide the solution to the problem? Washington. Immediately. And how long is that solution going to last? Wash?
7 years?
7 years. Okay? So, this is the 7 years of plenty. Now, this is the point that I want to get across, that so many people in the world, especially Christians, have not figured out. God says hard times are coming. Right? What does the average person do when they have a time of great plenty?
Spend it.
Spend it.
Go on
Right?
vacation.
You get a bonus at work, or stock goes up, or an inheritance, or you get a bunch of overtime, you have a good month, bunch of money comes in. What do people do with that money during the time of plenty? Spend it. Now, we might not all do that, but can we say that that is the majority? Money comes in, we spend it. All right. Now, when financial hardship comes up, especially in the life of a Christian, when do they expect God's provision?
Right after the problem.
Right after the problem. Right? The famine starts, things get bad, and what do they say? How is God going to deliver me out of this mess? How many times have I heard that? Now, in this story, when does God provide the solution for the hardship? He provides the solution before the hardship. You have no idea how many times people get a tax return, and what do they do with it immediately? Spend it. And then a month later, their vehicle breaks down or whatever happens, and they don't put it in their 401k. They don't put it in their savings account. They buy something stupid with it. And keep in mind, I'm not saying everyone does that, but we all know somebody that does that. And then when hard times come, we complain, man, how is God going to get me out of this? And I say, well, let me ask you this. Did God just write you a check? Did you just get a bonus? God doesn't ever promise to provide for the problem after or during the problem. In this story, he says, I'm going to provide the solution for 7 years leading up to the problem. And if everyone would have this mindset with their finances, a lot of us would do a lot better. Us young people are the worst. They have no concept of saving for a rainy day. Anyway, whenever I have a good month, money comes in, something great happens, I always have the thought, man, something's going to break. I better set this aside. And I am glad that I live by that biblical principle. Not all the time, not as well, I'm not as disciplined as I'd like, but I have learned this lesson, and I know that God's provision might be for something bad that hasn't happened yet. So I have to be a good steward of the money that God gave me. Anyway, that's a free one. Okay, that bit of advice cost as much as it was worth. All right, let's look at verses 37 through 41. So Joseph, a Jewish slave who just got out of prison, explains to the most powerful man on earth how to run his country. We agree that's just what happened? Okay, verse 37. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. See, lots of people were there. It wasn't just Pharaoh. Verse 38. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. Wow. Joseph is faithful in small things, and God rewards him with the greatest responsibility of the time. And I'm going to make a bold statement here. Joseph was tasked with saving the known world. He was not in charge of just saving Egypt. He saves the world. And we're going to see this. What you must understand is that the world far beyond the borders of Egypt comes to the nation of Egypt for food, to be fed during the famine. Joseph didn't just save Egypt, but quite possibly a good portion of the known world. And we find out that that famine reached all the way up to where? To Canaan land, to the land of Hebron. Who was living up there?
Dad and brother.
Yep, his dad and his brothers, Jacob and his 11 brothers, and that's part of the story. Verses 37 through 39. Here we go. Let's see what else. Verses 42 through 45. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried before him, bow the knee, and he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him a wife, Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Okay. So essentially, Pharaoh adopts Joseph. Whether this is exactly what happened or is not specifically stated, but Pharaoh does with Joseph what he would do with a son. He names him, he gives him a wife from the daughters of his high-ranking servants, and at this point, the nation of Egypt sees Joseph as a son of Pharaoh. He gives him his own jewelry and dresses him in a king's garments. The city of On, where Joseph's wife came from, is currently known as Heliopolis. It is about 7 miles north of Cairo, and it was once the center of the sun worship. And in verse 45, Pharaoh gives Joseph a name. Now, to be fair, we don't know what the name means. I haven't found anywhere. Nobody knows what that Egyptian name means. The belief of some linguistic scholars is that it means revealer of secrets, but we don't know. That is a conjecture. Don't hold me to it. Also, we'll come back to that. Okay, let's go through verses 46 through 49. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land. And in the 7 plenteous years, the earth brought forth by handfuls. And he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. The food of the field, which was round about every city, laid he up in the same. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much, until he left numbering, for it was without number. All right, so we see that Joseph was 30 years old when he became ruler over Egypt, which means 13 years after his brothers sold him into slavery. Joseph immediately gets to work. He goes throughout all the land and stores up 20% of all the produce in preparation for this famine. Now, I dare ask the question, what do you save up every month? Because we live in America and it's 2019, I know the answer is almost never 1/5 or 20%. But it is a principle that we are taught here. If we can live on less, 80%, and save more, 20%, I would imagine there would be fewer bankruptcies in America if we all did this. Now, I don't have time to get into it, so I'm just going to kind of kick this thing and keep going. But if you look back on what companies did prior to and leading up through the Industrial Revolution as far as capital that they had on hand, liquid cash and bank accounts, versus today, it would make you sick. Companies used to be set up so that they would be able to stop production and pay all of their employees for no less than 2 years. That's the capital that they used to have. And that was the capital that was required for the Industrial Revolution to happen, for them to be able to invest in the massive amounts of machinery and real estate and build the infrastructure. How do we do that today? We borrow. And companies today, you are lucky if they have 2% of their total assets in liquid wealth. 2%. Anyway, I'm going to keep moving. Okay. We read more details about this story in the Psalms. Turn to Psalm 105. We'll read through this and we'll be about done. Now, while you're turning to Psalm 105, verse 16, this is important. You will never, ever, ever get a full picture of the Bible until you read the whole thing. Because there are details about every story you read in the Bible in other books. Okay, boys, if you're looking for the Psalms, close your Bible, open it right up to the dead center. Okay? Hold it up, open it right to the middle. Okay? That's the Psalms. Psalm 105, verse 16. You don't have to open it, just write it down, look it up later. I'm going to read it to you. But if you're taking notes, it's Psalm 105, verse 16. We read, Moreover, he called for a famine upon the land. He brake the whole staff of bread. He sent a man before them, even Joseph, who was sold for a servant, whose feet they hurt with fetters. He was laid in iron. Until the time that his word came, the word of the Lord tried him. The king sent and loosed him, even the ruler of the people, and let him go free. He made him lord of his house and ruler of all his substance, to bind his princes at his pleasure and teach his senators wisdom. Now, we get the additional detail in verse 13 that he was bound in chains. It never says that in the book of Genesis. But you have to understand that his prison sentence was no pleasure cruise. In verse 22, we find out in the Psalms that Joseph taught the Egyptian scholars wisdom. So the most learned men in Egypt, the land of sun-worshipping pagans, were taught by a Jewish slave. When I read that, I thought to myself, how many of them, after sitting under Joseph and being taught by him, accepted the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? I don't know, but I'm curious to find out. Verses 50 and 52 at the end here of Genesis chapter 41. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God said, He hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second called Ephraim, for God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. So Manasseh means forgetfulness, and Ephraim means fruitfulness. Later on, we're going to find out that Jacob adopts these two boys as his own, and that is why they become part of the 12 tribes of Israel. In verse 53, and the 7 years of plenteous that was in the land of Egypt were ended, and the 7 years of dearth began to come, according to Joseph had said, and the dearth was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, what he saith to you, do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold unto the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt, and all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all the lands. So the 7 good years are over, and then begin the 7 years of famine. The dearth was in all the lands, and remember, it says very clearly, it was not a local famine. It affected the known world. In verses 56 and 57, it says the famine was over all the face of the earth, and it says all countries came into Egypt. So this was part of God's plan in order to get all 11 brothers up in Hebron to come down to Egypt to finish out this story. With that, we're done with Genesis chapter 41. Any questions before we go home?
That priest of On it was On a city?
On is the city 7 miles north of Cairo, presently named Heliopolis. I believe it's Heliopolis or Heliopolis. And you can go there today, and there are many ruins. I do not believe it is a populated city, but I might be wrong. Either way, 7 miles north of Cairo, the city of On is present-day Heliopolis, and it was the sun-worshipping center of Egypt. And that's where Joseph's wife came from the priest of that city. I always wonder, how did that union work? You know, with Joseph being so clearly in favor of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then marrying, you know, the daughter of the high priest of the capital pagan city. You know, I always wonder. But I would imagine, excuse me, you know, I would imagine Joseph won her over. It seems like he won over everyone that he talked to. So.
Well, and all things are possible through God.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Okay, you guys are great. Have a good night. And, I should tell you, I ordered some equipment, which means that next week we should be back on YouTube Live. So I don't know how much that means to anyone here, because we all show up here, but you can tell your friends. So hopefully we'll see how this stuff works.